some interactions with extended members of his extended family. And I'm thinking of Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, who was first elected President of the United States in 1884. Would you believe in 1995, I had the good fortune to spend an evening with his son, who was 92. He was born in 1903, about 6 or 7 years after Grover had left the White House, and he was 67 when he and his wife had their fifth and final child. That was the one I met in 1995. We were sitting there at his home in Tamworth, New Hampshire, and I said, he was named for his mother, Frances. I said, Frances, you have to understand what a thrill this is for me to meet the son, not the grandson, but the son of a man I deeply admire, whose father was first elected president 111 years ago. How was that possible? I'm talking to his kid. And he was elected president 111 years ago. And his reply to me was, well, that's nothing. Clevelands tend to marry late and have children late. And my grandfather, Grover's dad, was an infant when Thomas Jefferson was in the White House. And I looked it up later. Sure enough, he was born in the second term of Thomas Jefferson. And then it was 1837 that Grover was born. In 1995, I was talking to Grover's son. Well, why is Grover Cleveland a man we should remember? A man of character. Well, I'll partially answer the question right there. Grover Cleveland is hardly remembered today, except to most Americans, as perhaps a very heavy president. I often have asked people, what do you know about Grover Cleveland? And usually that comes out, well, he was a big guy. Second heaviest president in American history, behind William Howard Taft, who had to be pried out of the White House bathtub. They had to make a bigger one for him because it wasn't big enough. He was about 350 at his peak, and Cleveland weighed at only 270 at his peak, but he was still the second heaviest president in American history. Others will say, well, wasn't he the only one that was president for 2 terms that weren't back-to-back? And that's true, too. None of that is a reason to admire him necessarily. But he was one of the most principled men ever to hold the office. He is a phenomenal example of a man who may not have been well schooled in terms of years in college, never went to college, well schooled on policy issues, but nonetheless almost always came to the right policy conclusion. And it was because of the great wellspring of character that he had within him throughout his life. He was the son of a stern Presbyterian minister. He was born in Caldwell, New Jersey in 1837. The family, when Grover was about 8 or 9, moved to New York, which is the state we more commonly associate with him today because that's where his political career emanated from. Never went to college, but after high school, he decided he was going to make a trip to that town in Ohio that was named for a distant relative, Moses Cleveland, but he actually never made it there. He was headed to Cleveland by way of Buffalo, New York, to visit an uncle who persuaded him to stay there. He earned, in a kind of an apprenticeship program, he earned his law credentials, began practicing law very successfully in Buffalo. As late as 1880, 4 years before he was elected President of the United States. The only office that Grover Cleveland ever held was 1 term as sheriff of Erie County, New York. That was it. And that was some years before. Then he went back to private practice as a lawyer. In 1880, some local folks in Buffalo say, you know, City Hall is pretty corrupt. We need somebody who's really clean and can go in and clean house. And so they ran him for mayor of Buffalo. He won. Became known very early as the veto mayor because he would nix one ordinance, one proposal of city council after another, usually because they were corrupt contracts given to people who had politically supported councilmen in their previous campaigns. He saved the city of Buffalo about $200,000 in a single veto of a $420,000 contract, and then put it back out to a company that provided the same service, just as good a quality, at a far lower price. He gained a reputation early, just as he had done as sheriff for 1 term, as a guy who was as honest as the day is long. Because to Grover, he felt that character really mattered. You just don't want to sully your character and someday look back on the life that was squandered. That really meant a lot to him. And so he was mayor of Buffalo, New York, and then within 2 years after that, elected governor of the state of New York, and 2 years after that, president of the United States, and ultimately for 2 terms. Where did he stand on the issues? Grover Cleveland was right on just about everything. When I say right, that obviously betrays some of my sympathies and maybe those of many of you here. But he was for free markets, sound money, small government, low taxes, free trade. He was against the early hints of a coming welfare state. He vetoed more bills than all the previous 21 presidents combined. My favorite Cleveland veto was of the so-called Texas Seed Bill in 1886. It would have given $10,000, which in today's dollars would be roughly $2 million. $2 million federal tax dollars to drought-stricken farmers in Texas. And in his veto message, he said, and this is virtually verbatim, he said, "I can find no warrant in the Constitution for the appropriation of public money for the relief of private distress." This was the guy who put his hand on the Bible and said, "I swear to uphold the Constitution." If he didn't see it in there, he said, "Well, then we can't do it." He actually meant it. And he acted accordingly, and it was a big reason he vetoed more bills than all the previous 21 presidents combined. In that same veto of the Texas Seed Bill, he went further and said, though the people may support the government, it's not the duty of the government to support the people. And further, in the next paragraph, he says, in times of distress, we can always count upon the charity of our fellow countrymen. And of course, he was absolutely right. He was not the kind of man who would show up at the scene of great need and say, well, I'll get you some federal money and don't forget me at the next election. He would rally Americans and the best that was in them to come to the aid of their fellow countrymen. The Louisville Courier-Journal, a newspaper in Kentucky that still exists today, but I think with a very different editorial stance, they came to Cleveland's defense and said, we will prove him right, that those farmers will get the aid that they need without reliance upon the federal government, and we'll prove it by raising, within our readership and our influence, at least as much as he vetoed in federal money. Marvin Olasky, in his great book a few years ago called The American Leadership Tradition, talks about this episode, and he points out how much the Louisville Courier-Journal raised. How much do you suppose? Cleveland vetoed 10,000. How much do you think that one newspaper raised? Over $100,000. And they didn't have to wander it through a federal bureaucracy to get to the farmers in Texas. Cleveland was advised by his closest advisors in 88, going into the re-election battle, that he should keep quiet on the tariff. That was a big issue back then. Cleveland was a known free trader. At that time, we didn't have an income tax. And tariffs were the primary source of revenue to the federal government. So when they talked in those days about cutting taxes, they usually meant cutting tariffs. At that time, the big issue in terms of the budget, unlike ours today, was not what to do about the deficit. The big issue, time and again, in the 1870s and 80s, was what to do about the surplus. Year after year, these chronic surpluses were piling up, and the Republicans at that time were the party advocating, well, let's spend it. Cleveland was a Democrat at the time when the Democratic Party was the low-spending free trade party. And he was always advocating, if we have more revenue than we need for the just and efficient functions of government, we don't look for something to spend it on, we give it back to the people we took it from. So he was lobbying for lower tariffs, lower taxes at every opportunity. So his advisors said, though, in 1888, you better keep quiet on that. It's too hot of an issue. You'll lose the whole Northeast if you stress that issue. And Cleveland famously said, but that's where I stand. To him, it was important to simply tell the people, here's where I stand. I don't need the job so badly that I'll prevaricate just to please. So if you don't like my position, then vote for the other guy. It reminds me of a famous line from Groucho Marx. Actually, it's a very different sentiment than what Groucho Marx, in a very humorous way, expressed. But he was, in one of his movies, head of a fictional country, and he said at one point, "Those are my principles. If you don't like them, I have others." But you wouldn't hear that from Grover Cleveland. He was a man of principle. He thought you should know what they are. He stood by them, and it was perfectly all right with him if the people said, "No thanks, we'll go with the other guy." Well, that's what they did in 1888. He actually won more popular votes than the other guy, Benjamin Harrison of Indiana, but he lost in the Electoral College, one of only 4 times in American history when that's happened. I remember after the 2000 election, I took the opportunity after Mr. Gore's not taking that loss very well, to talk about how Grover Cleveland handled a similar loss in 1888. He was asked at a White House press conference what he thought about getting more votes than the other guy, but not being president again. And I suppose the reporter who asked that may have expected him to complain or something, or to whine about it. But his answer was, "Those are the rules. Those are the rules. We knew what they were going in. You have to win in the Electoral College. I have no complaints." But Mrs. Cleveland, whom he married in the White House in that first term, first president to marry while president in the White House, he was 49, she was 21, and she was not an intern, by the way. I remember that evening with their son, Francis, for whom he was named for his mother. He told us a lot of stories about what life in the White House was like, but not from personal memory, because he was born years after the Clevelands left the White House, and his father only lived another 5 years after Francis was born. Grover died in 1908. But his mother, because she was so much younger, she outlived Grover by almost 40 years. She died in 1947, so he told us stories that his mother had passed on over the years, including the one about in the first term, the White House had not been wired for telephone very long. Telephone had only made its appearance in 1876. And there weren't many Americans yet who had telephones. But on Saturdays, in the late, it would be like 1885, 86, 87, if you happen to have a phone and called the White House on a Saturday when the staff was out, and Mrs. Cleveland often was out around town, and if you said, "May I speak to the president?" you'd frequently get a voice that said, "Speaking," because Grover Cleveland was answering the White House telephone on Saturdays. And that's, not all that long ago. It's hard to believe. Grover lost that election in 1888, retired, but Mrs. Cleveland made it plain to the White House staff they were coming back and to change as little as possible. And sure enough, in 1892, after 4 years of Benjamin Harrison spending like the proverbial drunken sailor, Cleveland couldn't take it any longer, and he announced he was going to run for president again. And he beat Harrison handily. He became president the second time. Immediately upon taking office, he's faced with the beginnings of a panic and a deep depression, the second worst depression in American history. It began with a panic of 1893. He works to try to shore up the Treasury's dwindling gold reserves, but the drain in the Treasury from some really stupid legislation, the drain of gold, was so great that we breached an important bare minimum in May, and that touched off a panic on the stock market in the beginnings of the Depression. Cleveland was about to call the Congress into special session in June of 1893. He knew what the cause of the panic was. It was the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, which was passed under Benjamin Harrison. That act was requiring the Treasury to buy up almost the entire output of American silver mines at twice what it was worth, and mint silver dollars and also print paper silver notes and push them into circulation at the same time. So we have foreigners like the British saying, "We're getting out of here. We're withdrawing our capital. America's going crazy with its currency." They're flip-flopping from a gold standard to a potential silver standard at a time when the whole world's marching in the direction of gold. And they're pumping out all this paper money. Cleveland knew that that law had to be repealed if the Depression was to end.